Okay, so do you want to just jump right into it then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So it's called the big questions. As I like to tell my guests, the most important question or the hardest question to answer in my experience is the first one that I'm going to ask you. Who are you?
Yeah, that is the $54,000 question, isn't it? Well, I guess, from a purely normal perspective, because, we have to speak in regular terms now and then in our day-to-day lives. Well, I was born in 1984, given the name David McMurdo. And growing up, I wasn't raised within a religion of any kind. I was my mum and my stepdad. They're not anti-religious, but they're very practical people. They don't really, from their point of view, there's just better things to do than think about these big questions. But for whatever reason, the interest in these big questions in life was always inherent in me. And so growing up, I examined just about every spiritual tradition you can imagine. But towards the end of my 20s, I felt a bit of disillusionment with my search. I didn't feel that I found anything that really resonated with me. And I always wanted the truth. It wasn't enough that I found something that appealed to me. It had to be meaningful in some way. It had to be true. But then I think the most significant point is that at the age of 27, I was in my office one day and I just came in the morning as usual. I put the kettle on and I sat down and I was sitting there thinking about prayer. And that was nothing unusual because, like I said, I always had an interest in the big questions. But as I was thinking about prayer, I don't know if I reached a conclusion intellectually or not, but all I know is that at once whereas I'd always suspected that God existed, now I knew it for sure. I was just filled with this peace and this joy, and it was just an amazing feeling. It lasted for a few minutes, and I was certain that not only was God real, but he was all around us and everything, and then it faded. But I couldn't go, so to speak, back to sleep after that. And so that intensified my spiritual journey even more, and that's what led me here, essentially. And I guess I should say, just so that people understand that last year I adopted my spiritual name, Druce Gildas, as my legal name, and that's what I go by now. It represents a clean slate, essentially. That's the whole point of spiritual name. So that's the short story.
Wow, that's very cool. And I was one of my questions that I wanted to ask you was, is Druce Gildas your birth name? And there you go, you've answered that. That's great.
No, it's not, but I don't mind, because obviously people in this town, they still know me as David, and I don't get offended if they call me David, because a spiritual name is just as false a name as your birth name. It's not who you are. It's just a way to give yourself a clean slate psychologically. And it's been an amazing thing for me to do. But if people want to call me David, that's no problem at all.
Well, I prefer to call you Druce because you meet a lot of Davids in your life, but you don't meet a lot of Druces. So that's where did that name come from? Where did you get it from?
It's an ancient Celtic name. I always felt I wanted to remain connected to the time and place in which I was born, which is the Highlands of Scotland. And so Druce is an ancient Celtic name, and Gildas is also an ancient Celtic name, and it was also the name of an ancient Christian saint. So I just felt that the first part of the name should be aspirational, and the second part should remind me of my place. So Druce means wise or of the Druids, and that's what I aspire to. I aspire to that kind of wisdom, and Gildas means servant of God. So the name itself isn't aspirational, but it's a reminder of what my place is and everything. So I thought it was appropriate.
Yeah, tell me about it. That's awesome. I've never heard of people doing that, but that makes a lot of sense. And especially the part about it being psychological. I mean, you understand that your name is just a placeholder or a label, but there's power in that label. So why not use it?
Exactly. There's no need to run away from the things that are inherent in the material world and that we take for granted every day. If anything, they should be used to your benefit. So
That's
I think
right.
reality is to be played with, and there's no need to run from it. As you said, earlier today, I watched the last discussion that you had. As you said yourself, there's no point running away from reality because you're not put to the test if you run away from reality. And so not only if you, as a spiritual person or someone on a spiritual path, you partake in that reality, you should be able to transcend it and use it to your own advantage. Jesus said that he had overcome the world. He didn't have to run away and hide in a cave.
Yeah,
The
he didn't
world
say that.
have
Yeah.
power over the spiritual.
Yeah, he didn't say he escaped the world. He overcame it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Rising above versus running away, right?
Precisely. As you pointed out yourself, he went out into the wilderness and he was tempted by Satan, but he returned in power. The point of our periods of isolation is to center ourselves, is to empower ourselves precisely so that we can return to the world, not so that we can hide away from it. I've always had that problem. I mean, I've been very, very inspired by the likes of the desert monks who used to live around Alexandria. I like a lot of their writings, but I do disagree fundamentally with the whole idea of a monastic life. I think that kind of misses the point, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to agree personally, but I mean, everybody's got their own path, and the fact that those people went out into the desert and now you get to read their writings and gain something from it, obviously they had a purpose, and they had
Exactly.
their actions had meaning. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the problem with spirituality, and you said was it your parents or your stepdad and your mother you mentioned earlier? They're very practical people.
Yeah, yeah.
I I,
And
I agree with that. I think it's good to find practical use in these things, because if you're just reading the scriptures to give yourself a sense of, I don't know, being divine or whatever, it's not going to help you in life. You need things that are practical that you can take with you into the world.
yeah, the problem with my mum and stepdad is that they view spirituality as if it would conflict with what they've got to do in their day-to-day lives. And I can understand why, especially, I mean, I guess it'll be different in this country. In the United Kingdom, religion is almost non-existent. If you talk to someone around here about the basics of Christianity, they're not going to have the first clue about it. They won't know. I mean, I remember speaking to someone about the supposed resurrection of Jesus, and they didn't even know about that. I mean, to most people in the United States, that is unthinkable, that someone wouldn't know at least what the story of Jesus was. But that's how low religion is around here. And the religion that has persisted is a very crude form, I would say. So I understand why people like my mum and my stepdad have this impression of what spirituality is about that's incorrect, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this brings up an interesting question, because I am always talking to people about spirituality and what does spirituality mean to you? So why don't we go with that? What does being spiritual, or what does spirituality mean to you, Druce?
It means to live life with a focus on the transcendent, but the emphasis is on living life. You still got to live your life, but by focusing on the transcendent, you can bring something into your life and indeed into the world that you hopefully still participate in that other people can't, because they don't focus on the transcendent. So a spiritual life to me is a focus on the transcendent with the aim of bringing what you can take from that transcendent into your day-to-day life. That's as simply as I would put it, anyway.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. And I love that I've probably asked at least a dozen people in the last couple months that question, and I've gotten about a dozen different answers. And I love that. Personally, I think it's fascinating. I love words and culture and symbolism, because really, why do we have dictionaries? Because nobody uses the word with the dictionary definition in mind. It seems like we all have our own internal dictionaries that inform us about what words mean, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where do you find the transcendent then? Because that's an interesting way of phrasing it, and I'd be interested to hear that.
The transcendent is to be found on the inside, I would say, quite simply. See, I can relate a lot of this to my spiritual journey growing up. I was under the illusion, during, from my younger years to my late 20s, that the truth that I sought, whatever it was to be found in the external world. So in my mind, I would stumble upon some text somewhere and look, this hidden text has revealed to me the truth of the universe. But I now know that is not the case. It's all inside. As Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within. It's all within. And once you understand that, you begin to appreciate not just obscure mystic texts, but even well-known texts like the New Testament on a completely different level. And so, yeah, the truth is to be found within, and that's where the transcendent is also to be found.
Yeah, that's great. The transcendent, I mean, there's different words for it and different labels for it. But yeah, I think that what you're saying is fundamentally true. We're all focused on the external and trying to achieve something that is within us the whole time.
Yeah.
Right. So
Absolutely.
it's a bit of a hamster wheel, right? Yeah. So you found the transcendent when you were 27, then, I guess, would be based on your experience there?
Yeah, I did, but I made a mistake, a terrible error in judgment. And this was because I wasn't raised within a religious framework. So I had this transcendent experience, this experience of the divine, whatever you'd like to call it. But having no religious framework and no knowledge of mysticism, essentially, I made the mistake of turning to organized religion then. Because my thought process was, okay, now I know for sure that God exists, but I don't know what to make of it. For one reason or another, I attributed my spiritual experience to the person of Jesus. I wasn't raised a Christian, but it could have just been mere cultural influence that caused me to do that. And so I thought, well, what do I do now? I can't go back to sleep, as I said. So I went and joined a local Baptist church. And for a few years, I got very, I'd say, bogged down in theology. And it was fine intellectually. I learned a lot. And so I know Christian theology inside and out now, and I can argue it with the best of them. But spiritually speaking, I wasn't gaining anything. And I slowly became I went through what I like to call the zeal of the convert. You find that people who convert to a religion who weren't raised in it, they're really zealous. And my theory about that is that people who convert to a religion in that way, like myself, they've never really had something to believe in before. And if you give such people the answers in the form of a book like the Bible, they're going to be very zealous about it. And I was very obnoxious, very ignorant, and I was unbearable for a period of time there. Thankfully, whatever was inherent in me from the beginning, it brought me through that period. And I can't say I regret that period, because I learned a lot from it, both about theology and about myself. But I came through that out the other end and ended up where I am now, which is a far more spiritually edifying place, and certainly from other people's perspective, I would hope a far less obnoxious place than where I was before.
I'm sure. Yeah, I can't imagine you as a 27-year-old evangelical, going out there and the end is coming.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that people like yourself didn't know me back then. And although they say that what's on the internet never leaves the internet, I've made sure that's not necessarily true.
You found a black hole somewhere to just
whoop. Life finds a way.
It's interesting that you talk about this desire to, or this zeal even, to go out and to sort of spread the message, which has obviously resonated with you at the time. That seems to be a really common pattern. And I mean, well, basically your whole story, first of all, from the 27 years onward, is a very common pattern from my own personal experience, and also from talking to other people like yourself. It seems to be that I'm assuming it came from a good place. Like, obviously you had been searching for so long, and then when it finally hit you, you just wanted to give that gift to others. And so I would imagine it came from a good place, this zeal, right?
That's a strange thing. I've thought about this a lot, is that I can look back in hindsight and I can see how obnoxious I was, and I can see how frankly ignorant I was, because I mean, it's mind-blowing anyway to be that kind of evangelical type Christian here in the north of Scotland, where it's just ridiculous, basically. But when I look back on that, I can't of course, from my own perspective, I wasn't being obnoxious, and I was doing it for the benefit of others. For some reason, I adopted this theology wholesale. My search had always been for the truth, but I adopted this whole theology rather uncritically. And so, from my perspective, I had the same motives as I think your average evangelical type Christian. They want to save people from hellfire, essentially. They want to lead people to Jesus. And yet there was a viciousness there as well. I wasn't a happy person. And I don't think you can honestly say that the kind of raving evangelicals really are happy people on the inside, really content people. So I don't know. I suspect there was something amiss there, but I'm just glad I came through it, because I'm in a far better place today.
And how did you come through it?
Only by the grace of God, I have to say. It was only the grace of God that led me to that experience when I was 27 anyway. And I think it has to have been what we would call the grace of God that led me through it. Whatever was inherent in me from the beginning and is not inherent in anyone else in my family or anyone else I know, whatever that is, call it a seed. I don't know. Sure. But whatever that is was still there, and my own zeal couldn't suffocate it, and it brought me through. And now I understand that seed more, and rather than my endless attempts to suffocate it through intellectual knowledge and becoming very zealous, I'm able to water that seed and watch it grow each day. And that's by introspection and meditation and reflection generally.
Wow. Yeah. So what was the actual, okay, so that's the internal side. I want to know the material world. What happened that made you go, whoa, what am I doing here? This isn't for me. I've gone the wrong direction after my transcendental experience, and now I'm going to leave this church.
Yeah, this is going to be a difficult subject because there are going to be a lot of people watching who are not going to like what I'm going to say because it deals with theology, but it is the truth nonetheless.
But we don't have to get into it if you're not willing to. I mean, I'm
Oh no,
just
I'm absolutely fine with it.
okay.
I just want to give that little warning first, is
Okay.
that I still, even no matter how zealous I was still, like I said, I thought I was doing the right thing, and there was still that part of me that genuinely wanted the truth. And I began to question certain doctrines within Christianity, specifically the doctrine of the Trinity and the idea that Jesus has yet to return. And I found that the doctrine of the Trinity, I mean, I could go into great detail about this, but what it boils down to is that the doctrine of the Trinity is a 4th century Catholic doctrine. Jesus and his apostles taught that no such thing as a three-person being. And this is not just my own theory. You can look at the historical record and see how this doctrine gradually developed.
Mm-hmm.
But whereas I thought at the time, well, this is the truth. I am discovering truth here. This is what I'm supposed to do as a Christian, discover truth, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But the response I got from other Christians in doing that was very hostile, and it very quickly became apparent to me that no, this is not really, in most cases, this is not about a search for the truth. This is about maintaining an orthodoxy. This is about maintaining a tradition in the face of all evidence. And that is what shattered my illusion in organized religion, if you like. It was on some level, it must have been very disturbing for me because, again, as someone who for the first time in his life had something to believe in, now it was suddenly being taken away. And the only way I could keep it was by pretending that I don't know that the truth is what I know it is. And so that was just against who I couldn't do it. And so, but when I started being called a heretic and things like that, that kind of freed me, because then I thought, well, if you're going to call me a heretic just for questioning these doctrines, then I might as well go all the way. And so that freed me once again to pursue spirituality in any way I saw fit. And now, of course, and this is all over the New Testament as well, the Apostle Paul says, if I cared what men thought, I wouldn't be serving God. So this is all over these things. But in practice, the religious don't tend to pay much attention to that. They're very focused on maintaining tradition, and I couldn't do that.
Wow, yeah, that's interesting. So you had this awakening period, and then you almost had this sort of like dark night of the soul a few years later to set you back on course.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a great way to put it, the dark night of the soul, because people think of the dark night of the soul as a very negative thing, but it ultimately leads you to a better place once you endure it. And that's certainly what it was for me, because again, I lost that. I got this security that I never had in my life, because it feels nice to belong to something. And it is nice to belong to something. It's nice to have people you can call brothers and sisters because they believe the same things that you do. And then to lose that was very upsetting, but it was for the best in the end.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're better off, in my opinion, to be a solitary heretic than to be, one of many sheep in a flock, right? So, have you tried or made any attempts to find a different spiritual community since then?
No, I don't feel the need to. I like what Jesus said in the Synoptic Gospels. He said, he was sitting with his disciples one day and people came in from the outside saying, your mother and your brothers are outside. And he said, well, who is my mother and who are my brothers? It is they who hear the will of God and do it. So as far as I'm concerned, people like yourself, you're my brother. People who are sincerely searching for truth, they are my brothers and they are my sisters. I don't care what tradition they're doing it within. They could be Muslims, they could be Hindus, they could be Christians, they could belong to no mainstream religion at all. But as long as they're sincerely seeking the truth, we may come to different conclusions, but that is what unites us. We're united by the Spirit, and that's something that can't be replicated by organized religion. Organized religion tries to protect the values that originated it, but ultimately they end up corrupting it in most cases. And so as far as I'm concerned, if someone's sincerely seeking to know the truth, then they are my brother and my sister. So I don't feel the need to go out there and find a specific community, because when I examine that, I realize that that's just a part of ego. It's that need to have a group of people that will pat me on the back for affirming what they already believe, and I just don't need that anymore. So I like to walk alone, essentially, but I love it when I get to speak to people like yourself and others who have that sincerity and that desire for truth. So
yeah, excellent. Yeah, and I totally can relate. I mean, it's doesn't really matter what tradition you're coming from or anything like that. It's what's in your heart and what's in your character that I'm really concerned with. So I've met a lot of really nice mainstream Christians, met a lot of really not so nice, secular people who don't believe in any religion. So, I mean, it's almost a moot point, right? I mean, with the ism that you subscribe to is almost irrelevant, because you could be belonging to the same religion as another person and have very different characters and outlooks and beliefs, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So,
and it's funny what you said about them trying to preserve what gave them life in the first place, the beliefs or the doctrines that were there from the beginning. I don't know if it was the last person I interviewed, Hadeen, but I remember saying something about, a living tradition dies when you institutionalize it. And so all the wisdom that you're finding now in the Gospels and in the New Testament, it's there for all of these other denominations of Christianity, but they've entombed it, basically. They've, stuck it in a tomb, and it doesn't live anymore. It doesn't help anybody. It's just dead.
absolutely. It's like I always say, these great religions, and I'm not completely disparaging of religion. It has its place, certainly on a societal level. I think it's disastrous when you take away that, because it's a force that unites society. And we see that in Western Europe now with the way things are going. Whereas in Eastern Europe, they've still got a very strong tradition, and it shows, quite frankly. It shows in the family unit, which in Western Europe is breaking down rapidly, precisely due to the loss of this great institution. So I'm not entirely dismissive of organized religion, but for the one who is focused on the spiritual, who is focused on the transcendent, these spiritual traditions, they begin with a great teacher, the likes of Jesus or Buddha or whoever it may be, and he teaches what he knows to his immediate disciples. They go and spread his teachings further afield. Perhaps at some point they'll be written down in scripture. And then eventually, if these teachings become popular enough, an institution will be formed around them. And that is the seed of organized religion. Mm-hmm. But you can't realistically expect in this world those who come to power in that institution to be all saints. You can't expect them to all be children of God. There are going to be bad individuals there, and the corruption that follows is inevitable, quite frankly. So it's important to look at these things honestly without being dismissive of them. Organized religion has its place, but there's no point pretending that these institutions are perfect when they're clearly not. That's my point of view in it anyway.
I completely agree. And, especially where, it's kind of slippery to talk about religion in a blanket statement, because there are so many different types of religions, and especially online, when I talk to people who are anti-religion, I find that what they're really anti is mainstream evangelical Christianity or fundamental Christianity. And as you start to talk to them and unpack the meaning behind the words, because they'll be talking about God, and then it becomes clear very quickly that they're talking about the invisible sky daddy of the Abrahamic traditions. They're not talking about the Tao. They're not talking about Brahma. They're not, you know what I mean? But yes, as a whole, I think anytime you have an organization or an institution of any kind, and there's any kind of hierarchy involved, the people who thirst for power are going to be there, because there's power to be had at the top of that hierarchy, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's a government. And the people who seek power are the worst ones to have it.
Absolutely.
So anytime you create an institution around a spiritual teaching, you can bet that it's going to be corrupted fairly quickly.
Absolutely. And I don't mean to pick on Christianity either. I'm not one of those people who fetishizes the Eastern religions. They all have their problems, some far worse than Christianity. But it's like you say, it's pretty much inherent in the beast, because those who seek power will rise to the top in such institutions. In the modern day, in Western Europe at least, those who seek power, they won't go to organized religion necessarily because it's so low here. Mm-hmm. But in the United States, there's still a lot of power in those institutions, and it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah, well, one of those institutions is the Republican Party, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to separate the religion from the political party in some countries and in some places. And in the United States, for me, it's the most blatant one, because they don't even try to hide it. They're so open about this sort of the way that their political and religious beliefs go hand in hand. And it's like, well, what happened to the separation of church and state? Like, they're flaunting it. So it's very arrogant. And I understand why there's such backlash against Christianity, especially in the States, right? If you're an atheist in the US and you live, God forbid, in some southern state or something, yeah, you're going to have a bone to pick against Christians or religious people. I understand that. But you seem to have separated religion from tradition, which I think is an important part.
Yeah, I think that all of these paths, they began as esoteric paths, and men turned them into exoteric paths. And the exoteric can often be a way into the esoteric, but in all honesty, the way these religions are manifested out there in the world, I don't really take it too seriously. I don't think there's much spirituality to be found there at all. All you can hope is that, I don't know about your own background, that would be interesting to hear if you came to where you are through some kind of organized religion. But if it hadn't been for that zeal of the convert stage, I wouldn't be where I am. I needed that doorway into the esoteric for sure. So again, I'm not dismissive of it, but I don't think there's much spiritual nourishment in the organized religions out there.
There's too much of a danger of getting caught there and staying there for the rest of your life.
Oh yes, absolutely. One, that's that you raised that reminds me of a certain incident that occurred, and when I was having a debate during my zeal of the convert stage. This was an incident that one of those incidents that really shook me and made me think, wait, what am I doing in this place? Why am I buying into this? Because there was an individual I was having a debate with, and I think this debate is still mine somewhere. We were having some silly debate about doctrine that ultimately doesn't matter, but at the time it was the most important thing in the world to both of us. And he said something amazing to me. He said, I've believed the same thing for 15 years now. And he meant it like he was being strong. He'd adopted his beliefs and he was clinging boldly to them. But I just thought, not learning is a virtue. To be given a set of beliefs or to adopt a set of beliefs and just fight for them, regardless of whether or not they're true, regardless of what facts are given to you, that is a virtue in many cases in organized religion. And so that was another incident that made me realize, wow, am I doing this? Is this what am I doing? Am I zealously arguing for things, and am I going to be believing the same thing in 15 years? Because that's not learning. That's just being dogmatic for the sake of being dogmatic. And so that was an incident that woke me up as well. I remember that now.
Was that shortly before the sort of you exiting this religion, or?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because I realized that I'm not going to quote Nietzsche, but I realized that the flaws I saw in other people, I was exhibiting myself. And I think it's just a religious mentality. And it's not true of all religious people, but it is true of many religious people. It's religious mentality where you defend things that you don't know whether they're true or not, and that you seek not to learn, because to learn is in some way to be unfaithful to the traditions of whatever denomination you belong to.
Yeah, and I hate to break it to you, Druce, but it's not just religion, it's politics as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I had a guy tell me at a barbecue one day, there was we had this government in place in Canada, the federal government, and it was, in my opinion, it was bad, but and in this guy's opinion, it was bad too, and that's the worst part. He says, yeah, I know so-and-so is a liar, and he's done this, and he's done that, but I have voted conservative for my whole life, and by God, I will die voting conservative. So he told me, I agree with you about everything you just said about this scumbag, but I am committed. And it was the same with your guy. 15 years, I believe this. And that for them, that's a point of honor. It's a badge of honor, right? It's like, I've always done this, and I'm going to continue to do it.
Yeah. And I think all issues with development, especially spiritual, I think they come fundamentally from a place of ego. And in the case of what we're talking about, these individuals, their ego is now attached to what they're believing in. In your case, what this individual is voting for, and in my case, the doctrines that this individual is espousing. And so now it's not just about looking for an objective truth, because these ideas have become bound up in this person's ego, and so it becomes a threat to them to change their ways. And so your guy, he can't change who he votes for, because it's part of his identity now. He's voted that way for so long. And my guy, he can't change, the things he believes, no matter how much evidence there is against him, because that's him. That's part of who he is now. Everyone knows him as that.
So how do you get past that? I mean, for you, it was, you had sort of a revelation, right? You saw yourself in this guy, and it was like, oh crap, am I becoming this individual? But for the average person who may not have the kind of introspective nature as you and I, is there a ticket? Is there a way out of that? Or is it a blind alley? Like, are you just trapped?
I hate to say this. I don't think there is for a lot of people. The way I've always put it is this, sometimes, I don't know if you ever had someone say this to you, but I like to go long walks in the moors, and I live a very strange life for someone up here especially. And I'm very at peace. So I like to go long walks on the moors, and there's a nice little patch on the moors I like to sit and meditate in. I don't, aside from what I have to do to earn a living, I'm not involved in much. And I've had people say to me, well, we can't all live like that because society would fall apart. And they're probably right. And I think that there is an inherent balance in the physical world where the people who want to go all in as far as the spiritual is concerned, they are always going to be an extreme minority. The majority are always going to be those who tie their egos to certain things, whether it be politics or religion, and then there are going to be those who just don't care. And so I think there always has to be this inherent balance in the physical world. And so even these people that we're speaking of who can't seem to detach their egos from whether it be politics or certain doctrines within religion, perhaps they too have a place. I'm sure that they play a part in this great illusion of life. And in time, whether it be in a future life or what have you, perhaps their time will come, but their time isn't now. And it can't be now because there always has to be different kinds of people to make up this world of duality being what it is. That would be my view on it. I realize that sounds a bit fatalistic, but that's the conclusion I've come to myself.
Well, and it's certainly backed by observable evidence as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
If you look at the state of the world, and if you take a poll, if you just converse with people on a deeper level, instead of just asking about how's the weather, you start having the types of conversations that you and I are having with people, you realize very quickly that what you're saying is, it appears to be true, at least, that the majority don't have any time or interest in this kind of topic or this type of discussion. And if you try to take it there, they tend to their eyes roll to the back and show the whites, and then you go, okay, all right, I'm not going to talk about this anymore.
I can see the pain in your face when you say that. That speaks to me of personal experience. Have you? Because I've had that experience many times myself, and I know exactly what you're talking about. It's very frustrating because what the kind of experiential spirituality that someone like you or myself will be engaged in, we know how fulfilling it is, and naturally we want to share it, especially with those we care about. And it can be amazingly frustrating when someone, especially someone you care about, they just, as Jesus said, they do not have ears to hear. And you want to give the person you care about this amazing thing you've discovered, but when I think back, if I was in my early 20s, what if I had gone back in time and spoken to myself in the early 20s, and I went up to him and said all this now? What would I have said in my early 20s? I would have thought the guy was crazy. And so I always have to remember that from their perspective, they're just not there yet. And it's only by the grace of God that I'm there, because I know that experience that I had that transformed my life, I didn't do anything to usher that in. The best I can say, in the book of Hebrews, it says that God rewards those who diligently seek him. And I always remember that. And I think maybe a part of it was the fact that I was open to the truth, whatever it might be. But other than that, it was just the grace of God. And so it can be very easy to get arrogant about these things because you begin to look down on other people. It could be very easy to do that, but they are just people who are in a different place in their journey, essentially. And so, whereas in the beginning it was very frustrating for me to not, for what I say to not be even listened to at all by people I care about, in the end, I understand. I wouldn't have, there was a time where I wouldn't have heard it either. So what about you? What's your thoughts on this frustration? I don't know what the situation is with your close family, but are they open to the kind of thing that you and I would talk about? Or because it goes without saying that family is the worst because of the closest.
Well, yeah, I've got, that's a whole story on itself. But what I really want to tell you, Druce, is that what did you call it? Your period of, what is it? Something zeal?
Zeal of the convert is what I call it.
Zeal of the convert, yes. Okay, so So yeah, I know when you started to talk about that, it was like I knew exactly what you were referring to because I've been there. But for me, it wasn't. I wasn't part of an organized religion, so I had a similar experience to you about 4 or 5 years ago now. Same thing. I didn't do anything. I didn't achieve anything. It just happened to me, and since then I've been on this path. But right after it happened to me, I started to research, because essentially what had happened to me was I was sitting there in my cubicle doing office work, listening to a podcast, and I started to think about something, and I don't even remember what it was about. But as I continued to think about this thing, it led from one thing to another. And then all of a sudden I was beyond thinking, and I was having this experience of ecstasy and bliss, and tears came to my eyes, et cetera, et cetera. And so for the next couple months, I started doing a lot of research and trying to understand what had happened and how could I possibly experience the type of happiness I'd been seeking for 30 years without actually doing anything, just sitting there minding my own business. And as I started to learn and explore these different traditions, I got the zeal of the convert. It was burning hot in me. And everybody and my coworkers, my family, anybody I could talk to, I would just start telling them, hey, it's all about perspective, man. And, whatever. And that's when I had the eyes rolling. So, I experienced it firsthand, and that's what I try to remind myself now is that I think there's a quote that from Ram Dass, and he says, to the person who's had the experience, no explanation is necessary. To the one who hasn't had the experience, no explanation will do.
That's a fantastic quote.
And that's what I try to bear in mind now from no matter what. And I don't talk to people anymore unless the conversation goes there naturally. Before I would force the conversation because I just wanted to tell you about all the stuff that I'm excited about and that has changed my life for the better. Now, if the conversation doesn't go there, I just keep my mouth shut. But even when it does go there, I just try to remind myself, until you experience it, there is nothing I can say that's going to convince you. And that helps me a little bit because, then it's not so bad. But I'm pretty blessed. My wife is very open and receptive to all of this, and she got to witness firsthand the transformation that occurred 5 years ago in me. So she believes because she's seen the evidence, and maybe she hasn't experienced all of the things that I've experienced, but she's actually on her own path, and she's made a lot of her own progress. So I'm blessed in that regard. I'm not, at least my spouse doesn't roll her eyes at me too much. But, but as far as like my parents go, they're Jehovah's Witnesses. We don't talk at all. I don't have any contact with them anymore. And that's my family. I don't have any other family. My family is the people that I choose to incorporate into my life, and my children and my wife. So I'm lucky that way because I don't have to have those awkward Sunday dinners with my parents where they're talking about their beliefs and then we get into arguments. None of that. So yeah, but the zeal of the convert is real.
Yeah.
And it comes from a good place, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And I always remember that when I encounter the sort of hellfire preachers now, or see them about, they're
trying to save you.
Yeah. There's so much in what you just said that I want to pick up on. I hope you don't mind. I mean, I've asked you questions. First of all, what you said about the way your wife has responded to your own transformation, that is a great example of how the best testimony we can give is not merely giving beliefs or giving theories, but it's our own lives. That's the best testimony we can possibly give. The authors of the New Testament, they wrote of what they experienced of the Holy Spirit, but the point was not that we just, assume what they say as fact. The point is that we learn from them and we become living testimonies ourselves. Our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that was the entire point. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, when you were talking about that transformative experience you had, you were thinking about something and you came to some kind of conclusion, and that's exactly what happened to me. I was thinking about prayer, and I was thinking something very, very obvious, like, okay, what if one person prays one thing and another person prays another thing, and God is going to answer both of them? How would God decide whose prayer? It was something kind of silly, I guess. But maybe, now obviously when we speak about the spiritual, words are inadequate, of course, as you just said. So I'm just going to put forth I don't know, an example and see how you would relate that to your own experience. The way I've thought of it before is that perhaps I have my intellect and it's thinking about prayer, and it hits upon a conclusion that somehow pierces the roof of the intellect, and this ushers in this spiritual experience. That's the only way I can think to illustrate it. How would you think of the illustration as far as your own experience goes? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's not only does that align with my understanding of many spiritual traditions, especially I think in the East, like Vedantic philosophy. Their approach is using the mind to transcend the mind. So if you go to like a Zen tradition, they're all about no mind, like put the mind away. You don't need that thing. It's a piece of garbage. Whereas the Hindu approach or the Vedantic approach is more about using the mind to escape the mind. And I think that that's what you're describing, and that's certainly what happened to me as well. The way that I illustrated it before, because it took me years to even put it into words, was that I was chasing some kind of insight through my psyche. And let's say the mind, the intellectual mind is a jungle, and I was chasing it through the jungle, and then I broke through the jungle and I came upon this cliff, and I was overlooking this entire vista. And so suddenly I wasn't thinking anymore. I was beyond thinking, and I had this experience, this view of the world, or whatever you want to call it. And it was like, it was so clear. It makes so much sense. And that's when the tears started coming, and I was like, yes. But what I saw, I couldn't describe, because I was beyond the mind at that point. I had gone into some part of the psyche that I had yet to explore. And that's where that, like you said, that divine or transcendental experience came from. But your illustration is exactly what I would describe mine. Like I was thinking, and then all of a sudden I was beyond thinking, and I was in ecstasy. And I thought someone drugged me. And then a week later I was still riding high, and I thought, well, I better check into the mental institute, because, I'm obviously having a break. But nothing, it just kept happening. It just kept going. So,
Yeah. I wanted to ask you that precisely because of what you just said, that so often these approaches, these spiritual approaches, they are focused on, as you said, no mind. And so it's hard to share the kind of testimony that we might, because it implies that there's a way that you can actually trigger these experiences through the intellect. But as you pointed out, there are philosophies that have taught this anyway. It's just not what I would have expected at any point.
No, same. Yeah. And I think especially in the West, you probably will agree on this, we're really mind focused and mind centered, and everything's about logic and reason, think, don't feel. And so to think that the mind is actually just the tip of the iceberg, and a pretty puny one at that, and that everything else underneath the water, the intuition and the heart and all that stuff, is really what drives everything, is, it's a pretty disturbing revelation for someone in the West, I think. Whereas in the East, it's commonplace knowledge.
Yeah, and how, this is interesting. How would you view the mind? Do you view the mind as an enemy? Because I think it's quite clear that in the New Testament, the mind is characterized as Satan, and the demons are those tormenting thoughts that arise. And you can see this very clearly. But then we get into the area of, well, is Satan really a servant of God, if we're still continuing with this metaphor? But do you see the mind as an enemy, or more as a thing that can be harnessed for our own benefit?
Yeah, I personally subscribe to the view that it's either your faithful servant or your cruel master. So yeah, it can be made to serve you. And in fact, that's my part of my goal in spiritual practice, is learning to observe the mind, understand its inner workings and its mechanisms, so that I can take over and make it work for me instead of having it work on me. You know what I mean? So I think it can be harnessed. I think it should be harnessed, because why would you set aside this powerful, amazing, miraculous tool that nature has given us, or God, or whatever? I mean, no other animal on this planet can do what we do, and it's all because of reason in the mind. So to set that aside and go, it's bad, it doesn't work well, is, to me, it would be a waste. What's your view on that?
So often mind is characterized as the enemy, but perhaps a difficulty in this comes from how we decide that the human being is composed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned in your last interview, actually, the Bhagavad Gita, and the way that it dissects the human being, if you like, or dissects what we are. And it got me thinking about that again, because I remember in the Bhagavad Gita, is it not the case that you've got the mind, yes, but then there's something called the intellect? And you could use, I guess, interchangeable terms would be will or attention. I don't know. I mean, this is where the difficulty comes. How does one define a soul? I mean, do you have a specific view on that, or do you prefer to keep things far simpler than having this diagram of what we're composed of?
Well, I can't help myself. That's part of my nature. I love to analyze and I love to look at things and to dissect and stuff like that. But personally, I look at it this way. I think that there are many different models of the human being, different ways of looking at not only the human being in totality, but also the psyche, the mind, the unconscious, the conscious. So, if you study Carl Jung, he's got it as a dichotomy. It's the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. But if you look at the brain anatomically, there are three parts to the brain. There's the reptilian, the mammalian, and then the neocortex. So there's all these different ways of looking at the mind, the brain, the consciousness. And I think ultimately, each model is only as good as the information and the insight it provides. So I use a bunch of different models. I like Plato's analogy of the chariot, right? The chariot, the charioteer, and the two horses. One is beautiful and strong. The other one is dumb and doesn't listen to anything, right? To me, that's a great analogy of the human animal, but it's not 100% accurate. It's just a useful model that I use when it's convenient. And otherwise, I use a different model.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more on that. And I think it's important that I sometimes worry, if I watch my own videos back and I hear myself speak, I sometimes think, if someone doesn't have the first clue about mystic tradition or any of this stuff, they're going to be so lost. And I really don't like that. I don't like to befuddle people. It can be fun if someone is not going to listen to you or pay attention at all, and they'll come up to you in the street, and well, I guess it might not happen where you are, because I guess religion is more prevalent there. But if someone comes up to you in the street and tries to be funny with you, it's good to throw a riddle in their face and befuddle them, because they're not going to listen anyway.
Yeah.
But for those who genuinely want to know, I never want to be confusing to people, so I try to keep things as simple as possible, which it isn't easy to do.
No, well, and again, this is where the sort of Western, again, broadly speaking, the Western approach and the Eastern approach are both useful, because I think the Eastern approach is in some ways a lot simpler, because you're just setting the mind aside, meditate, breathe, and then when thoughts come up, watch them go like they're floating down the river. I think for some people that approach is a lot better, and then for others like yourself and myself, from the sounds of it, a more mind-based approach is useful, because we've grown up and we're attached maybe perhaps to the mind, and we've learned how to use it properly. So why not use that tool again to gain control of the mind, and then to transcend it and to make it your servant instead of being its slave, right?
Absolutely. Could not agree more.
Yeah, it's funny though, because maybe you could tell me this. Do you have you said you meditate, you pray. Do you have any kind of mindfulness practice where you take stock of what's happening inside you at any given moment, or?
Very much what you just described. Because I've looked into so many traditions, there are some people who are really influential, and I'm sure you've heard of him, Edgar Cayce.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah. Now I used to be a member of the Association for Research and Enlightenment. Just one of the many things I've been a member of in my time because of that spiritual quest I was on up to my late 20s. I don't know what to make of Edgar Cayce. There are reasons to be skeptical of him, but there's something about his readings that resonates with me on certain cases. I don't cite him as scripture or anything like that, but he's one of those individuals that I'm not sure of, but I pay attention to. And he said something wonderful once. He said that prayer is speaking to God and meditation is listening to God. And so I very much approach my spiritual practices that way. So I made a video on this once. I go through to my inner room, as Jesus said, even though that was referring to inside. But I close my curtains in my bedroom, and I just kneel on the bed and I'll pray to Jesus and the Father, because that's the terms I've become used to, and the least I can say is that they don't hurt. And so after I've prayed, I'll just sit there in meditation, and I do focus on this I am. Jesus very much is the I am, even in Christian tradition. And so I try to, as you just said, let thoughts arise. Don't try and suppress them. Don't try and go with them. Just let them arise. And if they take you for a little ride, then fine, let them take you. But just abide and become aware of your body, your surroundings, and so forth, and just get deeper and deeper into that awareness. And I think that after a certain point, even if you are someone like myself who does attach certain identities to the I am, and like Jesus Christ, for example, or God, I think it is important to drop those concepts, not because what they're pointing at is bad in any way, not that Jesus or God are bad, of course they're not. The issue is with your own concepts, because the moment you say God, the moment you say Jesus, you've got certain concepts in your head, and the concept is necessarily not the truth. You know, I'm very fond of Gnostic thought, and there was a specific group of Gnostics called the Sethians, and they were very fond of negative theology, where you can't describe what God is, only what God is not. And that way you eventually get to the truth of what God is that you can't possibly articulate. I'm very fond of that. So that's the kind of mental process I go through originally. But other than that, as you just said, it's about just remaining in the I am and that state of pure awareness. Some days after doing that, I get up off that bed and I don't feel much at all, but that's okay because I try not to bring any expectation into the experience. Other days I get up and I'm like on top of the world. I'm just amazed. How about yourself? Is that a similar kind of practice to that which you do?
Well, for me, yeah, I mean, I don't actually sit down and meditate very much. I try to meditate throughout the day in action. So if I'm, at work in the cubicle, or especially when I start to feel any kind of, negative emotion arising, like if I start to get frustrated, if I start to get anything like that, then that's almost like an alarm for me to become present and to center on myself and to focus on my breathing and let things settle, right? Because any action that I undertake while under the influence of anger, which is my drug of choice, or any resentment, bitterness, arrogance, another drug of choice, where I start to feel better than another person, or I start to think like you're such an idiot. Anytime I get a feeling like that, that's a lot of the times I automatically just return to myself. But as far as having a sit down meditation practice, I don't know. I just try to have one ear inside at all times. I don't know if that makes sense. Like I try to always keep an ear out so I know what's happening in here, because that's when I can get into trouble, is if I'm fully out there, then things can happen within me that will mess things up. So I just try to always be mindful, or at least partially mindful, of what's happening in my own thought process.
Yeah, it's like the Apostle Paul said, in everything you do, be mindful of God, and
Right.
also pray all the time. And people read that and they think, well, how can one pray all the time? Because they imagine prayer as getting on your knees, but of course it just means, again, to be mindful of God at all times, exactly as you described, and that's the way to go. I mean, certainly marathon meditation sessions are not necessary.
Well, and it's and it's not that I wouldn't like to do it. I would love to have time and the convenience to sit down or to go on a meditation retreat or to do anything like that. It's not going to happen. And for me, I've taken the path of action, so I can't be like those desert monks you described earlier. I have 3 kids. I have a wife. I have a job. I volunteer. I have a lot of things going. So I have to find ways to incorporate my spiritual practice into everything. Everything that I do is a spiritual practice. And if it's not, that's usually when I fall and stumble and get mad, or, I'm not my best self. So, but here's an interesting question for you that has come up based on your previous comments. You described the search for God as a negative search, like ruling out what God isn't, right? Like God is not this, God is not that. And eventually you get to something that is, right? And
Yeah.
is that what you would describe as the I am experience? That sort of at the bottom of it all, when you get rid of all the crap, you get to this sort of realization?
This is a difficult question, because on the one hand, we're speaking about an intellectual approach, and then on the other hand, we're talking about remaining in the state of pure awareness. If I was to just spell this out intellectually and from a Gnostic framework, I would say that souls are, as I like to say, fragments of the Great Spirit that we call God. And so in that way, we're all connected. At our truest level, we are what would be called children of God, which is just to say fragments of the Great Spirit that we call God, and that's why we're all one, and why the world is basically just consciousness playing out in all number of ways. That's how I would intellectually just throw it out there. But the experience is something else, and even an articulation like that I'm quite confident of, and I think that stands up to what the New Testament says, what all the Gnostic scriptures say, and what every spiritual tradition has to say. While I'm quite confident of that standing up, even that I'm so confident of, I don't want to take that with me into the I am experience, where I am just dwelling in a state of being. And so I do kind of distinguish between the intellectual approaches to these things and the pure experience, because frankly, although as strange as it sounds, my spiritual awakening was ushered in through that kind of thinking, I do get more, I find, out of just the dwelling in the I am, if you like. And that cannot, by necessity, it cannot bring concepts with it. It can only just, it is you, it is your being, you're just being aware. That's it. That's the best I can say on that subject.
Sorry to make you try to talk about what can't be put into words. I know it's a tricky, this entire conversation is essentially that, but okay. So do you think there's a connection between I am and Om, which phonetically or to the ear sounds very similar?
I don't know. I don't chant in that way. I don't, maybe it's just that a certain spiritual path I've gone down, but chanting and mantras can be useful to essentially convince yourself of something, to repeat something enough until it's absorbed into your head. So I understand that much, but whether phonetically they have some benefit, I'm really not sure of that.
Okay.
Whether there's a connection between Om and I am, I'm just not educated on that subject enough to say, frankly. But I don't chant I am or anything like that. It's just a concept that leads me into deeper places, from my perspective, anyway.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense. I was just curious. I've heard a bunch of different things about, for instance, the name Solomon has, you break it down into Sol, Om, and On, and apparently those three sounds have, again, stuff that I don't know about, that I've just heard about, and I thought, hey, maybe Druce knows about this.
I'm afraid not.
No worries. No, that's interesting. Yeah, the I am experience. You made a video. I haven't had a chance to watch it. I think it was your most recent or second most recent video about that. So I don't want to have like any spoilers here, obviously, because I want people to go watch your original video. But is there anything you could tell me about that experience that someone who may not be spiritual or into this kind of stuff could relate to? Like, what are sort of the hallmarks of that experience? Not describing it intellectually, but what does it feel like to just be grounded in that sense of being, that pure being that you described?
Well, that video was just an introduction to it, and so it's very, it's good that you asked that specific question, because I was just introducing the concept. First of all, there is, I think, to initiate someone, because Gnostics famously, divided humanity up into three categories. You got the Hylics, who were earthbound and were not capable of understanding the spiritual. You got the Psychics, who, they might be interested in theology and that, and some of them might ascend to higher levels, maybe. But then you had the Pneumatics, the spiritual, and they were the initiated. So initiated, partially initiated, and uninitiated. And I do like that framework, because for me, that reflects reality. So if I'm going to speak to someone who has no idea about any of this, and they have to be obviously open to this idea, the first thing I do is explain to them that this state that we call I am, it is not something that is new to us. It's not, we're not trying to reach a state that is alien to us. And the most common example I use, and the one I used in that video, was that of a baby. A baby is born for a number of minutes, hours, possibly days. It doesn't even have a name. It doesn't have a job. It's not aware of its own sexuality. It's not aware of whether it's male or female. It simply is. And so there's a very simple example of how we have existed in the state that we refer to as I am. It's just simple awareness. It just is. The baby, even though it is experiencing and it's aware, it doesn't even know that it's aware, because it doesn't have the intellectual capacity to reflect on the fact that it's aware. It simply is. And so that's an example I used to point out to someone, that this I am state is something that is most natural to us, and it's the place where we're most peaceful. And if we want to go back into pre-incarnate existence, we can also say that the awareness that is coming through the baby existed even prior to the physical form of the baby itself. We can go in that direction if you want, but it's just your most natural, and because it's your most natural, it's just your happiest place. It's at once to recognize what you are, which is life itself, which is being, which is awareness, and it's okay to say that, but it's another thing to experience it. And unless you've experienced it, you won't get the power of the words I'm speaking there. So at once it's to recognize what you are, which is life itself, pure consciousness, but also to recognize what you're not. you are not the things that you associate with. That depression that's coming on you, it's alien to you. You're a witness of it. Likewise, all these things that you associate with yourself in life, things like work and so forth, they are not a part of you. They arrived after the awareness that is you. And so it's really hard to articulate the experience of the I am. The best you can do is explain the logic for seeking this state out in the first place, the fact that they have existed in it before, and then hope that people go and do it. Because I've always tried to encourage something called experiential spirituality. When I make a video, people don't have to believe a single thing I say. It doesn't matter if they believe a single thing I say, but if they go away and put into practice what I say in my videos, then they will know for sure.
Yes.
And then they can enjoy the frustration of other people not having a clue what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's like your whole scheme here is to just get people on your level so they can be frustrated the same way you are.
Yes. Yes, the truth has been revealed. All these years have made me better, and that's my whole objective.
That is too funny. Oh, man. Yeah, so I am basically is the experience of pure being. Unfiltered, untainted by false identities and thought and anything like that, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Because these terms and these words are so wholly inadequate,
yeah.
I just find it funny sometimes. I just really find it funny. It's like, I don't know. It's what it is. It just is.
Well, the baby illustration, I think, is a solid one, and I can see why you would use it. It probably has an impact because, yeah, I mean, the baby's not, the baby's crying, but the baby doesn't know that it's crying. It just is. It's just happening. It's a process, and there's no self-reflection, right? And so is that where the I am is lost, when we get that sort of level of self-reflection where I'm no longer just being, I am being Oliver, or I'm being a dad, or I am being whatever.
Yeah, precisely. That's it. And this is why Jesus said to his disciples, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Let these little ones come to me, for to them belongs the kingdom of heaven. Now, people associate those sayings with innocence. So Jesus is saying, well, you've got to be innocent. Yes, that's true, but it's more specific than that. It's about this state before we had all of this conditioning. Now, I had to write a quick addendum to that video on Facebook, because the impression one might get is that babies are enlightened beings. No, that's not the point. The point is that babies are an example of how we have all existed prior to all of this conditioning that we now take for granted. That's the point. I'm not saying that babies are enlightened beings, but it is true that different spiritual traditions have used the example of young children and their innocence to illustrate what we've got to get back to in a certain sense. In that video, I also talked about a metaphor of the Gnostics used to speak of how before we became incarnate here, we drank from this cup of forgetfulness, and we have to remember our original state. And you can also use the baby in that metaphor as well. There's also in the Gospel of Thomas speak of how we become drunk throughout life. So if you imagine us being born sober, that baby is sober because it's just awareness. And yes, of course, being a baby has its limitations because you're a tiny baby. You're a soul that's found itself in a tiny, wholly inadequate form, and you don't know how to do much with your new appendages and so forth. But as that child grows older, it begins to get drunk with attachment, with worldly attachment, whether it's identity in numerous ways, whether it's a career and so forth, until the point comes where it's so drunk that it thinks that it is Bob who works at the local butchers and all these attributes that aren't that came after the awareness itself, which is the true identity of that entity, if you like.
Yeah, no, again, it's as good as it gets with words, but I agree. And it makes sense to me. But again, having had that experience, it makes sense to me. And if I had never had that experience, maybe I would think that we're both on drugs right now. But the reason yeah, exactly. Right. But the reason I asked you is because I suspect that even people who have no interest in this, who would think that you and I are on drugs right now, those people have had those experiences at small, increments in their life. I firmly believe that everyone, after they became, after they grew up and became conditioned, there are times in our lives where we have these experiences that knock everything else out of the way, and we have that sense of I am, I think. I know I had some of those experiences before my big one, but they're small and you don't understand them, and they just kind of get forgotten. So I was that's why I asked you, what would you tell someone who doesn't have any sort of faith in this, or who doesn't even care about this kind of stuff? How would you describe that experience? And you've described it perfectly well. I mean, it's when all your concerns drop away and you're no longer concerned about what am I going to do tomorrow for, whatever, for dinner, and you're not Ollie or Druce, you are, and there's a bliss and a peace that comes with that.
Absolutely. And I would try not to frame it in a particular flavor of tradition if I don't have to. The reason I speak so neutrally is because of where I live. Because again, religion is so non-existent around here that I think it's wholly adequate to use an example of a baby and awareness and things like that. There's no need for me to speak in terms of the Father and Jesus, or to use Gnostic terminology. These are just different concepts pointing at the same truth ultimately. But if I was in the United States, say, a highly Christian country, I would definitely use Christian terminology to explain these things. Mm-hmm. And that could be beneficial or a detriment, depending on how open-minded they are. But that's the way I would choose to explain it. Yeah,
that's a very interesting way to do it, because you're right. I mean, it all really depends on your context, right? What's your cultural background? What's your spiritual background? Because depending on that, using certain terminology might turn them completely off, or it might have the opposite effect. It might go, this is what Jesus was talking about.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned how throughout different times in life we have these moments. What's been a frustration for me, and I don't know if it's the same with you, but given what we talked about earlier, our shared experience on talking to those people who just aren't prepared to listen, basically. But another frustrating experience I've kind of had is that because I stand out so much up here, because, again, spirituality is pretty much non-existent up here, there are times when people will come to me because they've suddenly got this. It's not necessarily that they've had some great divine insight, but they have started to ask the big questions in life. And it's usually, if a family member has died, for example, if they've got a serious illness, or if there's been a major tragedy in the world, there are these, or sometimes when they get drunk enough, there are these things that can happen in people's lives, and they have these brief, maybe there is more to life than this. Maybe I need to ask these questions. And so I'll have conversations with people, and I think it's been a great conversation. And so they go away, but then a day or two later, they're back to living their everyday lives. And that kind of, that's a shame. That it's like there's an opening there, but they are not prepared to take it. I think that unless someone has found a spiritual path, a definite spiritual path, or some kind of spiritual master, I think that people's teacher is suffering. The thing that opens people up ultimately to these large questions is when they reach a place where they realize that the material world and the world at large, it can't possibly satisfy them in the end. No matter how much money they get, no matter how much material comfort they get, they will never be satisfied. That will never fulfill them. So after people have suffered enough and they've come to the place where they want to know if there's something beyond this, that is the only time I think you can reach them. Because until then, there may be moments where they ask themselves, is there more to life than this? But it's often very transitory. It has to be a dedication to that question, I think. And that was what was inherent in me. And I don't know about you. Was that inherent in you, or did it just come about as you grew older? Or, I mean, if you, I hope you don't mind me asking, but if
no, I don't at all.
Witnesses, I have to assume that you were raised as one yourself, perhaps.
No, actually, that's the funny part. So I grew up without any religion, any spirituality whatsoever. My parents, my dad was an alcoholic. My mom was just a stay-at-home mom, and neither of them graduated high school. So not that they're dumb, but they're not educated. My dad's extremely clever, hard worker. He taught me a lot about work ethic and construction. I studied carpentry under him for years. But they didn't convert until I was 21. So they raised me without any spiritual religious guidance for the first 21 years of my life. So by the time I was 21, I was, dropping ecstasy and partying and, having a great old time. And then they became Jehovah's Witnesses. So I had none of that growing up, but I was an only child, and I I tend to attribute that partially to my introspective nature and the fact that I've always been comfortable in solitude, and I've always been able to keep myself entertained using my mind, either dreaming up elaborate, Lord of the Rings like fantasy stories in my head, or asking questions like what I was doing when I had that experience 4 years ago. I was having a conversation with myself in a way. I was asking questions and answering them and seeking answers in my mind. So I think that's kind of what primed me for it. When I was in like grade 2 or something like that, I remember having this really terrifying realization that life was meaningless, because I was waiting for the summer holidays to come about. And, I was in elementary school and whatnot. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, summer's coming, I'm going to have so much fun. And then I remember thinking, but wait, summer's 2 months and then I go back to school. And then I started to do the same thing in my mind, where I was like, okay, well, what happens when I graduate school? Oh, then there's high school, and then there's college. And then, so I had this sort of like, I almost saw my life laid out for me, and I went, holy shit, there's no point. There's nothing else. It's like, I got to go get a job when I graduate, and then all I'm going to do is work until I die. And then I had this big, freak out, and I was probably in like grade 3 or something. So I think that planted the seeds for me. But if I go back and it's easy to be a revisionist when you're looking back at your life and to go, oh yeah, that's why I'm like this. And it's like, is it really? I don't know. But I had all these chance encounters in life that led me to here. Like, I discovered Carl Jung when I was in junior high, and I was immediately enamored with him. I loved his idea of the collective unconscious. It resonated with me, and I felt there was something there, and I still do. And then I discovered Joseph Campbell, who is very much, if you've never heard of him, have you heard of him?
Yeah, he was very influential in George Lucas. Yeah.
But he was also...
Was his book A Hero with 1,000 Faces?
That's right, yeah. So I discovered him through... He did a TV interview with Bill Moyer, an American journalist. It's called The Power of Myth. Anyway, so I discovered him, and his idea is that exactly what you are all about, the esoteric interpretation of spirituality and mythology. So for him, I basically opened this book when I was 14 years old, and within the first 10 pages, I had a Bible, because I was like, I gotta see what this guy is saying. Like, I gotta fact check this guy, because he was saying something about how in Genesis there's actually 2 creation stories, and they're actually different. Right. And I'm reading this and I'm like, there's no way, this is bullshit. I went, grabbed the Bible. Sure enough, there it is. So I think those things kind of primed me, because now as I look at the world religions and I study different paths, I don't try to find the right path. I try to find the truth in each path. And then I take those little nuggets and I go, they're mine now. This is my truth. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So take what's useful and leave the rest. That's very much my approach as well. Yeah,
but it's a hard approach to have if you grew up in a single tradition and you were taught and conditioned your whole life to believe that that is the truth with a capital T, though, right?
Absolutely. As I said, when I went through that Zeal of the Convert stage, it was nice because I had that community around me. I belonged somewhere for the first time in my life. And even then, when I began to question things like the doctrine of the Trinity, it was so hard for me, but it was only 2 or 3 years that I'd been part of that community. I can only imagine how hard it is for someone who's been brought up in that kind of family and in a position where they know that questioning this doctrine not only means that they can't belong to this particular denomination, but also means that they'll be alienated from their family. I can't imagine how hard that is. I was very fortunate to be brought up. Although my mum and stepdad, they don't have an interest in spirituality, at least they let me go my own way. That's something I've got to be thankful for, certainly.
And I think you and I are in the same boat there, because like I said, my parents had no interest in that stuff either. And, when I was 14 and I picked up The Power of Myth at a garage sale, my parents didn't say, no, that's Satan's word. They had no interest in that. So for them, it was like, oh, Ollie got a nice book. Good for him. But meanwhile, that book planted the seeds which make me immune to their religion now, because I can't look at the Jehovah's Witnesses creed and in any sort of capacity say, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's like, no, of course not. I mean, I have so many other traditions to base off of that, I'm immune to that. But sorry, you were going to say?
I was going to ask, if you don't mind me asking, is that what is causing the conflict then between you and your parents then, because you've taken this different approach basically?
Yeah, I mean... Sorry, go ahead.
Is that how seriously they went into the Jehovah's Witnesses? So they're very serious about it, in other words.
Oh, I mean, there is no such thing as not serious if you're a Jehovah's Witness. Anybody who converts to that is serious. You're all in. So yeah, they are serious. But again, like they converted when I was 21, and I didn't have my sort of wake up call until I was, maybe 29 or 30. So for the first many years of them being Jehovah's Witnesses, I was fine with it. We had a good relationship. If anything, our relationship improved at first because it made them more. Well, I mean, my alcoholic dad obviously quit drinking, and there's all these things that happened, and from my point of view, it was like all positive. So for the first little while, it was good, but after my wake up call and then subsequently, I also joined another religion. I joined a spiritual community, a Unitarian Universalist church, which is essentially they have 7 principles, and one of the principles is you're responsible for your own spiritual path. No one can tell you what the truth is, only you can. So as soon as I read this on their website, I was like, yeah, I'm joining.
Yeah.
Right?
I found them very appealing, and I wish they had a church up here, but they don't.
Yeah. To me, it's like a place for a bunch of people like you and I who have our own independent beliefs to come together and share and learn from each other. So to me,
I don't know if you've done more, but I watched at least one of the talks you did.
Yeah.
Very, very impressive that they allowed you to do that. And is that what you just said? I want to do a talk, and they let you, or how did that come about?
Well, not quite. I mean, so I first of all got involved as in our church, it's called a worship associate, but really it's just like you're up there with the ministers and you're doing the announcements, and you give like a small reflective piece about something that happened in your life, right? So that's how I started. And then they were like, oh, do you want to, learn how to write sermons? And I was like, sure. So I took a workshop. And then a local church, not my church, but another church was like looking for speakers, and I got dragged into that. And so it kind of started that way. But yeah, they're very open, and we've had people talk at our church that come from a Christian background. We've had people from I had one lady come in and talk about Rumi. That was her whole talk, was about Rumi and Sufism, right? So sometimes it's almost more like a political activism talk. Other times it's very religious and spiritual, and then we have everything in between. So for me, it's perfect. I love all of that stuff.
I would love to have that kind of thing here on YouTube. You asked earlier about me searching out a community, and I said, well, I think people like yourself, I would consider my brothers or my sisters, and it would be great to have that kind of community on YouTube where we're all spiritual seekers coming from different traditions, but we're united by that search for the truth. That would be wonderful. I'd love that. But there's so few people. As I said, I've got 2 people recommended on my YouTube homepage, yourself and a Catholic guy called Enlightening. That's it. That's all I can find. I mean, yeah, you've got Eckhart Tolle and so forth, but they're basically big celebrities. And so, I'd like to have a little community of people, like-minded people who can share ideas like this. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't see why we don't start one right off the bat. Well, let's do it. There's Absolutely. No reason not to. And before we reinvent the wheel, I should probably just tell you, I sent you an invitation on Facebook. I'll cut this out of the podcast because this is like.
What was this? My personal account.
Yeah, to your personal account.
Right. I'll probably be buried away in some inbox somewhere because we're not on our friends list.
So because before I found the Unitarian Universalists, I was craving this same thing that you're talking about, this sense of community, having other people who are like-minded, not necessarily believe the same thing, but who have the same sort of approach to philosophy and spirituality that we do. So I created a group on Facebook called The 1,000 Paths. And the idea is that there are thousands of paths, but they all lead to one destination. Whatever you want to call that destination is your choice. So I wanted to invite you to that group. That's why I sent you a personal message. Yeah.
Excellent. I'll definitely join that.
Yeah. And we have a YouTube channel as well. So if, first, the reason I sent you the invite first off was because I thought, hey, share your videos in this group. There's about 500 members. And I'm trying to drum up more activity because I think it would be a good place for content makers to share their stuff, but also to expose yourself to other content that you might not encounter otherwise. So
that is such a great idea. Yeah. Great. Right. Absolutely join that.
Yes. All right, cool. And the problem that I had, I started it about maybe 2 years ago. The problem that I had was that I was the only person making content. So I was writing blogs every week and no one else was really participating. And so I was kind of like, well, this is basically just like my own personal thing, which wasn't my intention. So I kind of stopped and I started this channel that I'm on now so that it could just be me, because ultimately what I was doing in this other group was just me. But I've had people message me from the group and say, hey, what's happening? There's nothing happening in the group. So we're trying to kind of kickstart it back to life. So if you'd like to join us, we would love to have you.
I'll absolutely do that. Yeah, it can be very hard going, can't it? You know, speaking about these things is, I don't know, it's very hard to gain traction almost. I think it's, I don't know, that's a different subject, but I sometimes question whether I should have gone under the name Gnostic mysticism or not. I mean, I think it's beneficial to come from a particular tradition, but I just hope that people, when they see that name, they don't get the impression that I'm dogmatically Gnostic, like I'm going to argue for the Gnostic position. No, I just find their worldview informative and useful, and so I speak from it. So yeah, it can be difficult though.
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I mean, I don't think I don't think anybody's going to see that name and go, oh, this guy is a fundamental, Gnostic, right? Like, I think that if anything, more casual viewers will be like, what is Gnosticism, right? Yeah. What is that? Or they'll be like, good Gnostic, good. But yeah, I think ultimately the name, the quality, the sort of production quality, if you will, for me personally, I don't pay much mind to that. How many people subscribe to my channel? I don't care. How many people view or click like? I don't care. To me, these videos are a spiritual practice, and I don't know if you can relate or if you feel the same, but I get something out of making the videos. Oh, and yeah. So for me, it's like, that's all I need.
That's the sole reason. That's almost the sole reason I make these videos. In fact, you said it yourself in your last interview. Well, you used it in a different way, but you said that it helps to write things down. It can help solidify things. Well, I find the same when I make my videos. Quite honestly, quite often when I make my videos, I always do it on the fly. I never have a script. I'm formulating my own thoughts on these things, and sometimes I'll watch my videos back and I'll think, yeah, that's all right. But then, the last one I made, I was very happy with it. It's rare that I'm happy with a video because it's a benefit to me to get this out there, to express it, So that, yeah, my videos benefit me, and that's my primary reason to tell you the truth.
Yeah, and I remember you. I think you said it on Facebook. I'm not usually happy with my videos after the fact. I feel the same way. There's sometimes I'll watch a video that I did and I'm like, oh man, I should delete this. But I'm like, no, keep it, keep it. It's real,
It's become a running joke on my channel that I delete old videos because I'll go back to them and I'll think, I could have done this much better. So I'll get messages saying, oh, there's another 2 videos you've deleted.
No, oh my God, that's funny. Yeah, and that's ego. I mean, I recognize it in myself. For you, it might be something different, but for me, it's like, yeah, I flubbed, I messed up my word here, or I didn't say as much or as clear as what I could have said, but it's like, yeah, so what? I mean, you're making a lot of videos, dude. You're going to mess up every once in a while, and it's not going to be perfect, and that's good. It's good to be able to be at peace with that. Or at least I think it's good. So here's another question I wanted to ask you. There's a lot of questions I want to ask you, but you had another channel before Gnostic Mysticism. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've been on YouTube for 11 years now. And I originally came on just to do game reviews, and that led to me, doing game reviewing in this publication that briefly existed. That's a long story. But yeah, so I made game reviews, and because in my early 20s, that's just what I was into. I didn't see much else to do in life, although I still had that interest in the truth in the background. So when I had my spiritual awakening, I suddenly realized, well, I've got, it's going to be difficult because I've got these people who watch me for my gaming videos, but I can't make them with the same intensity that I did before. I mean, there's nothing wrong with playing games, it's fine, but they are just entertainment. And now my life was focused on something else. And so I started speaking about spiritual things. But much of that was done not long after the Zeal of the Convert stage. And I just felt that last channel that I had, it wasn't right, basically. And I thought that before I go out there and speak about these things, I need to be at peace within myself. So I removed that last channel, and I was away from YouTube for a whole year, sort of like my time in the wilderness, just to sort myself out, because you can't go out into the world and express these things if inside you are a bundle of confusion, which at that point I was, because I'd had this spiritual awakening, I'd been through this Zeal of the Convert stage, and I just wasn't sure where I should be going. And until I determined that, I realized I shouldn't be speaking about these things. But I came back with this latest channel, and that's it.
Oh, okay, that's cool. And that's another question I was going to ask you about games. I from watching some of your videos and just little things here and there, I was like, I think Druce is a gamer, or maybe he was a gamer. So, do you have time for video games anymore? Do you play at all, or are you completely done with that?
I'll play now and then. It's like everything. It's got to be done in moderation. And the problem is there was a time in my life where that's all I did. And I think that's becoming an increasingly common thing for people to do. And I can tell you there was a time in my life where I definitely lied to myself about the place of video games, especially when I was making videos about them. I kind of told myself that, oh, well, that I don't know, I just made stories up in my own head about how this was useful and so forth. But it's fundamentally not. They're just entertainment. But you see that a lot on YouTube with people who talk about video games a lot, especially guys who are like in their 30s and 40s and 50s. You know that sometimes they'll disappear and their fans will get really annoyed with them. But I understand perfectly why that's happening. It's because some level of them knows that there's got to be more to life than this. And it's honestly, to spend weeks on end working on a complex edited video, for what? It's a gaming video. So what? What purpose does this serve? And I'm not being downbeat on people, but this is just the truth that I felt myself. And so I couldn't go back to it. So I'll play video games in the same way that I'll watch a film now and then. I won't let it be detrimental to my spiritual life. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and they very well can be. I mean, like anything that's just a hollow distraction, like you said, movies or whatever, anything that you can just kind of use to bury your head in the sand is detrimental to your spiritual practice, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's every bit a part of worldly attachment as everything else. It can be very easy for someone, because I like video games, it would be very easy for me to justify myself in that regard, because I'm not a stupid person. I could come up with all kinds of justifications, and I could make a very convincing video about how, it's okay to play video games a lot. I could do that, but I've got to be honest with myself and say, no, don't lie to yourself like this. Don't deceive yourself or anyone else like this. You know that they're fundamentally entertainment, and as such, they're ultimately a waste of time. And that if you play a video game for an hour, you could be helping someone in your neighborhood for an hour. You could be meditating for an hour. You could be doing anything else for an hour. So fine, entertainment, enjoy it now and then, that's fine, but don't pretend it's something it's not. That's my approach now. Yeah,
and that's a good approach. It's true, though. We definitely do rationalize, don't we? I mean, I know I rationalize all kinds of things to myself. It's like, hey, this is fine. I don't have a problem with this or whatever. But it's funny. I was a gamer as well for my whole life, basically. I mean, I grew up on Mattelvision or something like that, like the old platform before Nintendo. So I was playing throughout my whole life, and then same as you, after I had this experience, it's not that I made a conscious decision to stop playing video games. It's not even that I don't like them anymore. I still do, and I still wish I could play more, but I just don't. I have things that are higher priority now, and so it's like, if I have time to play my little phone game, before going to bed, that's great. But yeah, it does take up a lot of time. And does it seem to you, maybe it's just me, but it seems to me that like games now coming out take up even more time?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And another thing that bothers me about them as well is that they're so disposable now. Back in like the 80s and the 90s, when you got maybe, I assume it was the same for you. When you got a game, you were playing that for months on end. Mm-hmm. But they weren't as long as they were now. You like Golden Axe. Takes me 15 minutes to beat Golden Axe, for example. But you would play them because that was a game you had. It was valuable. These days, a game comes out, you might play it for 5 or 10 minutes, then you're on to the next one, because it's just become such a disposable industry. And that itself makes it more depressing somehow. It's like, okay, I'm on to the next useless experience now. Mm. And I began to get, and I'm sure you did as well, if you try to play video games now, well, maybe you've got a wife and kids, so it might be different for you, but there's always that feeling on the inside, that niggling thought, no, I should be doing something more worthwhile here.
Yeah, I agree. For me, it's not even that. I don't even get to play them. I mean, I wish I could have that feeling of like I should be doing something else, because then it would mean I'm playing video games, but I don't even get to that point. I get to the point where I'm like, you know what, tonight I'm staying up late and I'm going to play video games and I don't care. My wife's going to go to bed. And then I end up falling asleep on the couch at 10 o'clock and I don't play video games. So. But I have noticed in recent years, and anytime I do pick up a controller or anything like that, if you want to play video games now, first of all, it seems like everything is online. So you're playing with other people, which I despise.
Same here. Single player guy, totally. I don't like multiplayers at all.
Oh my God, yeah. You and me really are brothers, Druce.
Yeah.
I swear. But then,
the
so
way
if
it's very hard, back in the early 90s, even among your real life friends, it was very difficult to organize, gathered around a TV together. One person would go in a bad mood because they lost. The last thing I want to do is play with complete strangers online, because that is the one thing that's certain to ruin the experience.
Absolutely, yeah. And then you're getting like, some 12-year-old talking shit to you, and you're like, kid, go to bed. Like, anyways, I've never even gone there, but it does seem like you have to invest more time to get better, because you're playing against people who have no lives. So it's like, if you want to be competitive in this game, you got to log in at least 30 hours a day. Like, you know what I mean? It's so, it takes the fun out of it. It becomes hyper competitive, and it's all about, you can't get anything done because as soon as you log in, you get killed by some 12-year-old who is a sniper, like
it's just a new version of bread and circuses, basically. And it's the same with sport. I know it's the case in the United States with the Super Bowl and things like that, but over here in Scotland, football, or maybe you call it soccer, I don't know, but it's massive over here. And it's just a distraction. It's just a way to keep people focused on things that are ultimately unimportant. And I feel video games have gone the same way now that they've become this billion-dollar industry, essentially.
Yeah, and sports is a great example as well. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think the Super Bowl is today, isn't it?
I have no idea. I really have no idea.
Now I got to find out. I know a lot of people who are very much into football and hockey. Football, not soccer. The football that you throw that weird ball around. Yeah. And they'll spend like hours and hours and hours watching it. And it's a commitment. I don't understand how you could possibly stay interested for that long.
Yeah. And this leads to a problem. There's so many things. I mean, I know you're the one that's supposed to be asking me questions, but the more you talk, the more questions I've got for you as well. Do you find it hard to speak to people? Do you find it, because one thing, even before my spiritual awakening and things like that, I've never liked small talk, but it's even worse now. It's like when I meet someone, I want to get to know them, like, for real. I don't want any nonsense small talk. I don't want to exchange pointless pleasantries. I want to get to the heart of the matter straight away, but increasingly I find it's difficult to do that with people. Either someone is open to you and they're interested in the big questions in life, or they're not. And I find that, maybe it's a flaw in me, but I find it very difficult to maintain that kind of pointless, polite conversation with someone. I feel like I should be, even that, I feel like I should be doing something more worthwhile. Do you have that experience as well, where you want to relate to someone on a certain level, but you find that you can't, and it ends in frustration?
Yeah, I find that if it's a one-on-one or a small group interaction, I'm okay. But usually if I'm at, if we've got a bunch of people over for dinner or something and everyone's talking about football, for example, I tend to get this really lonely feeling inside. Everybody's talking about their jobs or football or this or that. And I'm like you, that's everyday life. That's boring to me. I don't want to talk about that stuff. You said you don't like small talk. I can totally relate, man. I'm only into tall talk. I want to talk about the tallest, the biggest, like, let's talk about the faith of the world, or the fate of the world, and, politics and religion. And, when I was growing up, my dad told me very early on, there's only two things you don't talk about in polite company: religion and politics. Those are my favorite topics. Yeah. I don't want to talk about anything else. What could be more worthwhile than talking about our collective, future and, the direction of our world and, all these things. Right. So, it is. I don't say that it's hard. I'm pretty good at faking it and engaging in small talk, unfortunately, but I get really lonely. Even if I'm surrounded by 50 people, I feel like I'm the loneliest person in the world.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that.
It's crushing.
Like, you mentioned your father again there. I've got not a similar situation, but like, because my dad left my mum when I was 6. And so throughout my life, I've always tried to make an effort with my family. He lives like a few streets away, but I haven't seen him in like 5 years now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the thing is, I try to make an effort with him, but all he really wants to do is sit and watch TV. And even with him, I don't know, like, I'm so different from all of my family. I don't know where I came. It's like an alien dropped me off. You try to engage him in conversation, and it's just not forthcoming. He's just like, yeah. And he's just, all he wants to do is sit and watch TV. And there came a point where I felt, okay, across these years, I've made an effort with this guy, and I can't get anything out of him. When I go into his place, all I'm doing is sitting and watching TV, and this is a waste of my time, frankly. And I guess you're in a similar situation as well, because these individuals are our fathers. A part of me used to feel that I have an obligation to, I had an obligation to make an effort, and I did. But there's a certain point where you've done all you can do. Can you relate to what I'm saying in that area?
Druce, we really are brothers. I'm telling you, man. I know where you came from. You're my long lost brother. Yeah, of course, man. And this is conditioning, I think, because we're conditioned to believe that family is something that is a non-negotiable. You accept your family. You accept them for who they are. It doesn't matter if they're drunks. It doesn't matter if they're whatever. It doesn't matter if they're unpleasant, if they bring nothing good to your life, or if they only bring negativity to your life. It doesn't matter. They're your family, and you stick by them. And personally, about maybe 7 or 8 months ago, I finally was like, yeah, I'm done with this conditioning. And I didn't choose my family. I didn't choose my parents. And like you, I stuck it out for several years, despite not getting anything back, despite it not helping, despite it getting worse and worse, our relationship. So I got to a point where it was like, the best thing for all people's involved is to break. And that was my choice. I actually called them. Nothing happened. There was no escalation. There was no fight. It was something that was weighing on me. And I had this feeling that I had a duty to create distance and to cut ties. And after I did so, I expected to feel guilty, and I felt nothing but peace. And I haven't felt anything bad since then. And that was about 6 months or 7 months ago. So to answer your question, I don't think we have an obligation to our fathers. Definitely not. You didn't pick your dad. I didn't pick my dad. And I think that despite that, you have this sort of, you're hardwired to love your parents. And I definitely love my dad, and I'm thankful for the things that he taught me. But that was the past, and things have changed, and now we're going in different directions, opposite directions, frankly. So for me, I don't feel guilty at all having cut ties with them. But I can see how it would be hard to do that based on the society that we live in.
Absolutely. That's exactly how I see it as well. I used to wonder about the fact, because, growing up, the only reason I went and made an effort in the first place, because I felt an obligation to, but it was more of an intellectual obligation. I thought this is the right thing to do. It wasn't an internal thing. I didn't feel, I must do this. I made an effort because I felt I should. But yeah, as I said, now I think it's pointless.
Yeah. And much like you, my parents lived down the road.
Girlfriend, she's the one who writes the birthday cards, Christmas cards, and always has, since I was a little kid. And I just think, well, this is just a farce. What's the point in this? So, yeah.
Well, get to know the girlfriend. She sounds like a nice lady.
She's all right. I think she just does it out of obligation, right, as well. So, but that's what I was going to ask you, because these things. See, that's like what you were saying in the last conversation you had. This is life. This is real life. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where it's all put to the test, the spirituality. And yeah, I agree with you. From our perspective, there is nothing more to be done in that area. No matter what our spiritual ideals might be, and no matter what our state might be internally, there are certain situations, no matter how personal they are, they just have to be dropped, basically.
100%. Yeah, and yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny having children now. And do you have any kids of your own?
No. Okay. I'm very thankful of that. I have a hard enough time managing my soul.
I feel the same way, but I have 3, so that's a bad situation for me. But having had kids, I've realized that the parental obligation is very real. So my children, my love for them truly is unconditional, and there's nothing that they could do conceivably that would make me cut ties with them. But it's not a two-way street. That's what I've learned, because from my own personal experience, like you, I feel nothing there for my parents. I'm open. I've left the door open for them to reestablish contact with me, but I am not, I don't feel guilty or ashamed for having cut ties with them. And I don't miss our interactions, quite frankly, because there were no interactions.
Yeah.
So, even when we were together, again, sort of like I would just be very bored, because what are we going to talk about? Jehovah God? Are we going to talk about the truth? Because that's just going to lead to a big scrap. And I'm going to, and they're going to accuse me of being the servant of Satan, which they have before. So to me, it was like, okay, that obligation is not a two-way street. My parents probably feel an obligation to me because I'm their only son. And I feel bad for that to some extent, because it's like, well, it sucks. It probably hurts them that I cut ties with them. And that's unfortunate. But I don't feel that same way about them. I feel that way about my kids. Like my kids, I'll always be there for them. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter how badly they fuck up. I'm always going to be there for them. So do you think that your dad feels any of that towards you and your siblings, if you have any? Or do you think that for him, it's like he has no obligation to you either?
No, this is the funny thing. I think that he feels it but can't express it. Whereas I'm someone, I don't care about who knows what. I'm an open book, and so when I meet people, they either love me or they hate me. If you're someone who does not like to speak to someone on that level, then you're not going to like me at all, because instantly I'm open. I don't care who knows what about me. And my dad, on the other hand, I think he feels the way I do, but he can't express himself. Same as my stepdad. I'm the kind of guy, I'll say to mum, hey, Mum, I love you. Stepdad, John, I love you. He can't say that back to me. I remember one time when I was a kid, I said that to him, and he didn't say anything back. And Mum goes, well, he loves you too. You just can't say it. And it's true. But like I said, I'm an alien. I can't relate to anyone in my family, and they can't relate to me. But there's still that understanding that we're on our own path in a certain way. It's like I'll see my uncles sometimes, and they know I was never going to, for whatever reason, I was never going to lead the kind of life they might expect of me, where I was going to have the career, the high flying career, and I was going to be a doctor and have a family and all this. That was never going to be me, for good or ill. But even though we can't relate on a deep level, at least there's that understanding. But my dad, I think he's just incapable of expressing. And to me, that's a tragedy, because the way I think of it is that, look, we are here now, and either you are open, you are yourself with me, or you're not. But this may be the last time that we ever talk. So just be real, be who you are, and say what you want to say. That's my approach to life. And I just wish that at least one person in my family shared it.
Yeah, well, and it's not just your family, man. I mean, and sadly, it's especially true with males. I think we're not, it sounds like they come from that old school, sort of mentality of guys don't share about their emotions, right? And guys don't talk about their feelings. And you made a comment about how even recently, like 5 years ago, you'd go to your dad's place and try to engage him in conversation, and he'd just give you like these grunting answers, right? Like that sounds like the stereotypical man's man, right? Which is toxic and it's garbage. So limited.
Absolutely. It's kind of, yeah. My granddad was in the military, and he was, growing up, he was very disciplinarian. Always had polished shoes, and that on a Sunday when he had nothing to do, he'd be up like that. So that's the kind of environment I was raised in. Again, I don't know where I came from, but yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just didn't fit in that kind of environment, basically.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. And but that's the environment that made you who you are in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It had some kind of influence on me anyway, but it's not one that I'd replicate. It wasn't a bad environment. I don't know. I think that it was such a mess that, yeah, it was just, I mean, this is why I've never had to hide my name on YouTube, for example, because everyone in my family has a different surname. So, I mean, I've been doxxed before many times on YouTube. I think it's inevitable. But I don't worry about people reaching my family in that, because, yeah, it would be very, it's a very messy situation. So,
wait, yeah. You've been doxxed on YouTube?
Oh, yeah. I mean, because I've been on YouTube for 11 years, like I said. Right. So yeah, I've been doxxed over and over. I don't care anymore. That's why I have people visit me. Like, was it yeah, I think it was last year. This guy Matthias, I've spoken to him online for years. He's from Germany. He came to visit me here, and I don't mind that at all. I don't mind people coming to visit me. And it was just, it's strange to have people that you've spoken to online just sit on this very couch and speak to them. But I like that because I like to be open. I like people to know that I am what you see. This is not some front that I'm putting on when I switch on the camera and things like that. This is just who I am, and I like that very much.
And I like that too.
Yeah, it goes back to that openness that I've always felt, and that I think is very conductive to the spiritual path, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, how can you talk about this stuff and not be open? If you're talking about this stuff and you're hiding aspects of it, or you're portraying yourself a certain way, I think it's going to become very apparent very quickly.
Absolutely. And a difficulty I find, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this yourself, is that if I speak to someone like yourself, you understand what I'm saying, you relate to me, you can empathize with me because you've often felt the same way yourself. But if you speak to someone, like if we speak to each other enough and our communication is restricted to people just like ourselves, when you go back out into the world and you speak to other people, you forget how little they are prepared to speak this way. And I find that to be kind of a frustration. So as much as I disagree with the monastic life, I certainly empathize with it. Oh, it would be a wonderful thing to get like people like yourself together and just go off and live in a compound somewhere. That would be great, but I don't think that's what we should be doing.
No, I don't know about should or shouldn't. I part of me wishes, but I don't think it's realistic. And I think while you're in the world, while you don't have the means to start your own compound somewhere off in the woods, you might as well make the best of it, right? And try to
absolutely
enjoy what life has to offer. Well, that's interesting. One thing I'm also wanted to know is what do you do for a living? Do you work, or do you have some other means of supporting yourself?
Oh yeah, web development is what I do. So
awesome.
But because I'm a single guy, I basically work as much as I have to. I don't feel an obligation to build myself a career. As long as I've got a roof over my head, I'm happy. And I really do like the simple things in life as well. But yeah, that's what I do.
That's a good approach. I think very wise of you. I think a lot of people get caught up in that rat race mentality and they want more, right? And you're the opposite. You're like, I want what I need. You know what I mean? You don't need more. You want what you need. And what you need is, exactly what that is, and you work for it. So
absolutely. And that brings in problems of its own because, of course, you have expectations for yourself, but the expectations of your family are quite different. And so, I know my mum would love it if I was a doctor or a lawyer or something, but I just have no interest in that kind of career. I'm just happy to be. And that is, of course, especially the case these days now that I've reached this place of peace within myself, spiritually speaking. So, yeah, I'm just content.
Yeah. Well, and that's what everyone's looking for. The guy who's working 80 hours a week to get that next promotion, to buy the big house and stuff, the end result of all that, in my opinion, is a sense of contentment. Like, I've got it. Right? Like, I'm here finally. After 20 years of killing myself with this job, I've got it and I feel content. Well, what if you can just feel content right now?
Absolutely. That's it. It's not for no reason that some of the most miserable and corrupt people on the planet are among the richest. All the wealth and all the fame and all the fortune that these celebrities have, it obviously doesn't bring them any kind of fulfillment. If anything, it makes them worse. It drives them into destructive lifestyles, and it's just not necessary, frankly. It's just fine to be Hakuna Matata, as a wise man once said.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, if money brought you happiness, there would be a lot more happy people in this world.
Absolutely. If you don't mind me asking, because I'm really curious to know this, because you don't say his name much, but what is your take on Jesus Christ? That's a massive question, I realize.
Yeah, holy, yeah. My take on him is that the words attributed to him contain great wisdom and insight, but only to those like yourself who are able to go beneath the surface and who are able to decode the symbolic language that he was using, right?
Yeah.
I think that whether he was a real person or not is kind of irrelevant. Whether he was based on a real person and then mythological attributes were sort of laid on him afterwards, again, irrelevant. To me, it's all about the message. The messenger is kind of irrelevant. Doesn't really matter. I mean, I have my preferences. There are certain messengers that speak to me and that I cherish and that I follow more closely than others. But in terms of what it is I like about those messengers, it's the message. So if you can find that same message in the New Testament or the Gospel of Thomas, which I'm, as I'm sure you can tell, I'm in love with.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't have a huge attachment to the Christian tradition, but I've read some books that have made me appreciate it more in recent years. There's a Canadian author named Tom Harper. He wrote a book called The Pagan Christ.
I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, well, you probably would enjoy it, I assume, because it's basically, that's where I learned about the esoteric interpretation of the New Testament. And reading that book and then looking at the New Testament through that lens, I gained a lot of appreciation and love for it, because it was like, okay, so like, 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, there's a meaning to that. And all the, turning water into wine, there's a meaning to that. And it's not literally what he's saying. There's something underneath the surface that makes more sense to me. So, but ultimately I think that, again, it's all about the message. And if your messenger is Jesus, then all the more power to you. Good for you. I'm just happy you found a messenger personally, like a lot of people don't have that. So if your messenger is this guy, mine might be different, but as long as you're getting something out of it, then great.
It's weird how I think some people, especially atheists, they have a great difficulty in grasping what you just said, is that something doesn't have to be literally true for it to be valuable. For some reason, they think that, for example, you either interpret Genesis as being about a talking snake or it's worthless. They don't, there's a level of them that can't grasp subtlety. It's the equivalent of, telling the story of the boy who cried wolf and then speculating on how a wolf of that kind couldn't have existed in that area, missing the whole point entirely. It's just, but, the same is true in the religious world as well. They feel that unless these things are literal, then they're worthless. But whether these things happened historically or not, if the truths that they espouse can be lived by us, which they can be, that's a verification of them. And it's a greater verification than if some archaeologist can prove that a guy called Jesus once existed, at least in my mind anyway.
I'm with you, man. All these debates about, scientists prove that Jesus wasn't real, and it's just like, who gives a shit?
Yeah, I know. The sad thing is that religious people engage the atheists on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
They assume materialist assumptions instead of the spiritual ones that they should be assuming. And so instead of trying to convince someone painstakingly that Jesus once existed as a man, just say, go away and pray and talk about all these meditative practices, and then they'll be able to experience the spiritual, and you won't have to prove anything historically or otherwise.
Yeah, because it's ultimately the truths that he was speaking are outside of time. They're not dependent on cultural context, because you can find the same truths in the words of the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and all these different people who are across time and space. So to me, that's the true test of an idea, is if you can find it in all these different traditions and across, different cultures and eras, there's something there, and it's worth looking into. Whether you believe, whether you're an atheist or not, it makes no difference. I mean, there's a reason why the golden rule is in every tradition. There's a reason. It's because it comes from in here very deep. And no matter where you are in the world, no matter what culture you're from, that truth exists in individuals, and some people brought it out, and that's why it's in Islam and it's in Christianity and it's in all these different places. So
exactly,
people get too focused on the superficial or on the symbol, for example, and they don't understand the meaning behind the symbol, right? So
absolutely,
yeah. And then it's just like my God's better than yours. Well, your God is the same God. It's just you guys use different symbols for him, right? Or whatever you want to call it. So yeah,
absolutely.
Semantics.
Precisely. And of course, when we're speaking about the spiritual, semantics is particularly an issue, because the best we can do is point to it. And that's the whole reason for these mythologies. The Gnostics called them images. These are symbols of higher things. The resurrection of Jesus is a symbol or an image of spiritual rebirth. That's what it is. So whether it happened or not, like you said, pretty much irrelevant.
But for a fact that it has happened, because it happened to you.
Yeah, exactly. I know the reality of spiritual rebirth. What I don't know is that someone 2,000 years ago rose from the dead. That is beyond my knowledge. But because I've had that experience of spiritual rebirth, and because I attribute it to Jesus, I do have to take those stories more seriously. But that still doesn't mean that I know them. And I think that an essential component of the spiritual walk or the mystic path is sincerity. If you can't be honest with yourself about what you actually know and what you don't, then you can't possibly be honest with anyone else, and I don't think you're going to progress very far. So I'd love to, get on camera and say, I know for a fact that Jesus existed as a human being. I know for a fact that he died for our sins. I know for a fact that he was resurrected, but I simply don't. And most people don't. So
yeah, I don't know anybody who does. I mean, it's impossible at this point in time to prove it. And maybe in time we will discover evidence that he was a real person, and maybe not. But ultimately, it's not going to change how I feel about what he said and some of his teachings, right? And I mean,
absolutely.
and it's not even all esoteric either. I mean, there's some stuff that he says that is like, it's of practical use for anyone. So I feel like, and you will be much more better equipped to tell me this or not, but it seems like he has different levels of teachings, and some of his teachings are just like, don't try to pluck the piece of wood, the splinter out of your neighbor's eye when you've got a rafter sticking out of yours. Well, that's very practical. That is apparent to anyone. You don't need to know the symbology behind it or anything. It's like, instead of criticizing, look at your fucking self, period.
Yeah.
That's what Jesus was saying. But then you get to some of his other lessons that, again, you need to go underneath the surface. It's not just a superficial, the wisdom is there.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing about Jesus. There are certain ways in which he wasn't the man of the people that people make him out to be. First of all, in the Synoptic Gospels, he intentionally speaks to the masses in parables, and he explains to the disciples so that they won't understand him. They'll hear, they'll listen, but they won't hear. They'll look, but they won't see. And it's very strange. And then you've got the instant in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, which is the high priestly prayer of Jesus. And this is just before he's going to be arrested. And he excludes the world from his prayer. He says, I'm not praying for the world. I'm praying for my disciples. There is that sense about Jesus that he had these followers and he had these people who were prepared to listen to him, and he cared about them. They were his chosen ones, essentially. And everyone else, he'll talk to them. But as you said, there's that very basic understanding, and then there's a deeper level there. So I really like that about Jesus. I really like that.
Do you think that maybe he went through the zeal of the convert initially after his time in the wilderness, and then maybe he was like, you know what? These motherfuckers aren't ready. I'm going to talk in riddles.
Well, we're heading into blasphemous territory.
But you know what I mean? He's like trying to tell them, like, look within, and everyone's like, I don't understand. And he's like, these guys don't get it.
I feel that no matter how powerful a spiritual being they may be, anyone who's born into this reality, they have to go through what we talked about earlier. They're born as a baby, they gain all this conditioning, and that's why the Gospels couldn't care less what Jesus was doing before the age of 30. They mentioned the importance of his birth. They mentioned the fact that at the age of 12 he did this to show that he stood out even at that young age. But beyond that, they only speak about his ministry and beyond. So I personally think that Jesus went through all these stages that we've talked about. I think he had to have. And the first thing he does in the Gospels is he goes out into the wilderness and is tempted by Satan. That was his final test before he was ready to begin his ministry. And I'm quite sure he went through all of these things that we've talked about. He had to. And it's not because Jesus is lesser than us or anything like that, or the same as us, because people aren't going to like that. But it's just what happens when you're born into duality. You have to get rid of this conditioning and reconnect. And that's the reason that he had to be baptized in the Jordan by the Holy Spirit, with God saying, you are my beloved son, today I have begotten you, after his resurrection, things like that. So I think so.
Yeah, it would make sense, especially if he was just a guy like you and I, because I think ultimately the story of Christ is sort of like the story, a lot of other stories, and it points to the reality that you're him, or not him specifically, but there's a Christ within you, right? And that's sort of the death and the rebirth, is that awakening of that divine spark, or that seed, as you described it. And so I don't think he was ever trying to tell people like, I'm the special one. He was trying to say like, I'm special because I found this within myself, and now I'm trying to show you where to find that same thing,
What you just said, evangelicals and most Christians who are familiar with these things, they would likely dismiss that as like a new age reading of the Gospels and so forth. And when I was in my zeal of the convert stage, I would have done the same thing, despite the fact that I was completely ignorant of it. But no, the truth is, you're absolutely right. That's exactly what it is. The issue, the critical, there's a guy called Sir Anthony Buzzard, brilliant guy. He's a Unitarian, and he wrote a book called Trinitarianism, or the Doctrine of the Trinity, Christianity's Self-Inflicted Wound. And that's the crucial mistake that Christianity made very early on, about the 4th century, is that they deified Christ. And you can't follow someone who is God. You can't. And that's the excuse that Christians will make. They'll say, one Christian will literally say to another, "You are not Jesus." It's like, okay, I'm not Jesus, but the book of Hebrews says that he's our elder brother. Jesus says that unless you pick up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. It's explicit that we are meant to emulate Jesus. But if you even try to claim that you're attempting to do that, it's like a form of heresy.
Yeah.
And so that was the worst thing that the Christian churches ever did, was to deify Christ in that way, because it made him unapproachable and gave people all the excuse they need to not meet the standard of Christ, because they're not Christ. Well, he's God. He's the second person of the Trinity. How can I be like him? Well, he told you that you have to be. So, you either listen to your tradition or you listen to the words of Jesus. One of the two.
Right. Yeah, it's a no-win situation.
Yeah, exactly.
I never really thought of that. Yeah, see, and again, this is where I stand to learn a lot from you, and I already have, because my knowledge, again, of not only the Bible in its entirety, but all the different doctrines, because like you said, the Trinity is not in the Bible, is it?
No, it's not. The Trinity says that there are 3 persons that compose the one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. These 3 persons are co-equal and co-eternal. The Bible itself says nothing like that. Jesus, and Trinitarians themselves will acknowledge this because they have to. The God of Jesus was the Father alone. That was the God of Jesus. The doctrine of the Trinity was developed over the ensuing centuries, and it was finally formulated towards the end of the 4th century, which means that any attempt to even pretend, and we know this for a historical fact, any attempt to even pretend that Jesus or the apostles taught the Trinity is just absurd. And so most Trinitarians who know what they're talking about won't even try. They'll just still try to argue, well, this is a central doctrine in Christianity, but why should I listen to what a group of churchmen in the 4th century had to say? Because we know very well the nature of these churchmen. During the 4th century, there was all kinds of dirty deeds being done for the sake of these doctrines. These guys were killing each other in some cases. A guy called Arius, who proposed that Jesus wasn't God, but that he was the first created being of God, he died in highly suspicious circumstances and all of these things. Corruption very quickly entered the so-called Church of Christ, and I see no reason. From my perspective, I'll stick to the plain words of Jesus, or as the Apostle Paul put it, the wholesome words of Jesus. I'll stick to them. People believe whatever you want, but I'm sticking to what Jesus said. And Jesus said there is one God, the Father. That's it.
Yeah, well, there you go. It doesn't get much simpler than that, does it?
Yeah, exactly.
See, I find that the Trinity is an interesting concept because, again, not having the Christian connotation attached to it for me, I just tend to see the sort of, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, there are Trinities everywhere. It's almost like I can see why they would have tried to impose this very ancient and very sort of universal concept onto their tradition, but it doesn't work because it's not in the book and it's not in the tradition. So you're like imposing this idea that in and of itself might have value, but you're forcing it in, and then you're trying to convince people that it belongs there. It's like, of course it's not going to work.
Yeah, there was a lot of Greek thought ended up influencing them, which is fine. Greek thought is great. I mean, I like Gnostic teachings, and they're highly influenced by Greek thought, but you can't just mash these things together and hope that you'll get something coherent out of it. And that's why I think Sir Anthony Buzzard was completely right when he described the doctrine of the Trinity as Christianity's self-inflicted wound, because you take one look at that, you study that in depth for more than 5 minutes, and you see that it really does fall apart. And the worst thing is it contradicts everything that Jesus said, Jesus and the apostles. And that's why you get so many Unitarian churches, and I mean Unitarian in the theological sense, where, and that's why you get groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and so forth, because they recognize, no, this is wrong. There's something terribly wrong here. So,
interestingly enough, though, the Jehovah's Witnesses subscribe to the theory of that guy who got assassinated that you mentioned, Arius. Jesus was the very first created being of God. That's actually they've adopted that. And so when you read your favorite gospel of John, in the beginning there was the Word, they identify the Word as Jesus in spirit form before he came down to earth.
Yeah, and that is a far more reasonable And, you know, I've got my own ideas about Jesus, but in the present day, I try not to. I like to let him remain a mystery and reveal himself to me as I dwell in the I am. That's the way I like to do it. But doctrinally speaking, that is very good. It's certainly less damaging than Trinitarianism, which essentially removes, it makes it impossible for you to identify with Jesus, because he is and always has been eternally the second person of the Trinity. And when he comes down, it's like a trip to the dentist. He knows he's going to be fine. He knows it's all going to be fine.
Yeah.
And he's going to ascend to a height that you can't possibly attain, even though in the Gospels he tells you that you have to. So,
yeah, that is another point that has always struck me as comical. And I think I saw, of course, the internet. My brother-in-law tells me the internet is undefeated. It always wins. There's a meme I saw, and it was like, Jesus died for your sins, but he knew he was getting resurrected. So really, he just gave up his weekend.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like you're going in knowing that nothing's going to happen to you. So really, what's the sacrifice, right? So you got to look at it a slightly different way from that. Otherwise, it's not going to hold up.
And not only that, all of these doctrines fundamentally assume a literalistic interpretation of all of these things. So, like, original sin assumes that there was indeed two individuals called Adam and Eve, and they did indeed eat from this tree against God's advice. And of course, I don't buy into any of that. So,
no, again, that story for me became much more powerful and significant when I started to look at it allegorically.
oh yeah, I mean,
there's an interpretation of that story that puts the entire human condition into context. And it went from being this like child's fable to a profound, insightful story for me in like the flick of an eye. So it was very interesting.
absolutely. So when those unbelievers that you mentioned earlier, when they come up to you and, like you said, what they really hate is the evangelical interpretation of Christianity, I can have sympathy with them, but I just hope, and I find in most cases they're not, but I hope that they're just prepared to listen to an alternative. Say, no, you don't have to understand these stories in this literalistic fashion. There is a better way to understand it. But most of them, I find, are not open to that, because quite often I think that their hostility, or I think it's just an excuse to not have to ask questions. I think a lot of people want to soothe their conscience with the idea that there's nothing larger than themselves. Because if there was something larger than themselves, then they'd start to have to ask the big questions. Mm-hmm. And so people can get very hostile if you so much as raise these issues, because they just don't want to face them, in my experience anyway.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one explanation for it, or that explanation applies to some people. I think that a lot of the people that I have met have been burned by religion firsthand. And so it's sort of a pendulum effect where they went from being raised in a fundamentalist Christian household, and then, like yourself, doubts started to creep in because they started to think about these things and go, wait a sec, this doesn't line up. And then they realized, oh crap, I've been lied to, or I was misled. So there's a ego wound there. It's like, there's embarrassment because how could I believe this stupid stuff for so many years? And so the pendulum just goes boom, and now they're like Christopher Hitchens style atheists, like, who can't be reasoned with, who think that everything that is worth discussing is material and there's nothing else to discuss, right? So
absolutely, they essentially throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there's no need to do that. It's a tragedy.
It is.
And so I understand why, when he was alive, Jesus, he was harsher on no one more than the Pharisees, on the religious leaders of the day, because they have misled people and betrayed them in a great way. Mm-hmm. And I'm very thankful that zeal of the convert stage that I went through was very brief, because sometimes I get contacted by people will send me a message and say, you know what, I used to be an evangelical Christian for years, and I was out there in the streets and I was preaching and all this stuff, but now that I'm pretty much where I am, I feel this guilt now, because I've told all these people this evangelical interpretation of Christianity, and I have to live with that. And I think about the people that I convinced of that and what they're doing now, and that's a hard situation to be in. I mean, there's no reason, obviously, you should free yourself from that kind of guilt, but that's a hard situation.
Absolutely. But you have a great answer to those people, because if you hadn't been led into this evangelical belief system, you wouldn't know what you know now, and you wouldn't have experienced these things, and you wouldn't be making these videos now and spreading your truth. So in a way, maybe the people who were out there preaching their evangelical message, maybe they led other people down the same path you're on now, right? I mean, who knows? You can't look back and feel guilty about stuff that you did in ignorance. Now they know better and they should move on, right?
Exactly. It's just like Jesus says in the Gospel of John, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But since you claim you see, you are still guilty.
Right.
So, yeah, we can't be held accountable for things that we're ignorant of. God is merciful to all of us. And so I tell him not to worry. And like you just implied there, we can't see the massive spider web of cause and effect. We have no idea what I think we all have a part to play, no matter what terrible state we're in, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But I'm just glad I'm where I am now. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, well, I'm glad where you are too, man. And I'm glad that we're able to get together for this discussion. We're going on close to 2 hours now, so I think we should probably try to wrap it up. I have a list of other things I want to talk to you about, if you're willing to do this again, of course.
Oh, absolutely. I've very, very much enjoyed this. And thanks for inviting me on, and I look forward to coming back as well.